one of the consequences of both the earthquake that has hit Syria and Turkey and the Ukraine-Russia war has been supply chain and in a number of sectors, but more importantly, food. My question is, we've heard a lot throughout the day about people warning of the impact of technology. Can technology help countries become self-sufficient at some point where these sort of events do not affect food security?
So the answer is yes, and it's great to be with everyone today. So we have evolved to a system, when you think of food production, where we have a lot of centralized manufacturing, and that was done to bring down costs. At the same time, that could put a lot of stress in our food production systems where there's, whether it's COVID, an earthquake, a war, whatever it is, that could reverberate through the whole supply chain, and it could lead to food shorts. So the way to get around that is to have a more distributed food system. And there are technologies that are allowing for that. And I'll give 3 examples. So one, AeroFarms, my company, all enabled by wonderful technologies. So here, the efficiency of a diode, a light-emitting diode, has opened up this whole world of indoor farming. Another example of technology is a company called Every. We make, and I'm lead at the board level of these other 2 companies, we make eggs not through a chicken, but through precision fermentation, taking yeast, taking glucose, and effectively creating an egg, but not through chickens. And here you could build these production facilities anywhere in the world. Another one, Aspire, where we take a lot of robotics and use insect proteins, so grow insects level upon level in buildings the size of this for protein production. The other part of that is we as human beings need to embrace these technologies, so there's a human behavioral element where we have to also think about consumption of proteins and nutrients, not just calories, and we have to embrace these new technologies. But the answer is yes, technology, whether it's diodes, robotics, automation, computing power, are really enablers to whole new landscapes of technology. If you think of CRISPR-Cas9 and the sequencing of a genome, and cell-cultured meat, that's another example of a whole new avenue of food production.
Right. Before I move on, I want to do a quick follow-up question based on what Professor Dotta had just said about the growing division between the haves and the have-nots, between richer countries or countries that have the technology and countries that don't. Am I right to fear that the solutions that you've just described are going to serve perhaps richer countries or countries that are much more equipped for technological development, and as it happens, those countries have a less problem with food supplies than, for example, developing countries that neither have the food nor the technology?
So if you think of the technology adoption curve, you have the early adopters, then you have mainstream. And typically the early adopters will pay a premium, and those are countries that have either greater political will or more resources. And that's a necessary process for any technology adoption. You think of solar. Solar, the early adopters were Germany, the US, then you had mass manufacturing, and now it's a solution for sub-Saharan Africa. And you have the electrification in poor areas. So it happens, it doesn't need to be the first one to happen. So here, if you take like AeroFarms, we're building here in Abu Dhabi. We just announced a program with PIF, we're building in Qatar. And here, those are richer countries, but they're embracing new technology and they're early adopters. So technology leaders like myself, while we build in the US, we go to the early adopters, and then as the cost structure goes down, then you have solutions for poorer countries. So these technological solutions have broad applicability for different demographics, different members of social economic groups. It doesn't all need to happen at first, it's just following the technology adoption curve.
Understood. Michala, no matter how we look at this, it always goes back to supply and demand, basic economic problem. So, and we've just talked about the division between the haves and the have-nots, but there's also another division. There's a division between countries that are less populated and countries that are overpopulated. If you look at this region, for example, despite the lack of resources, I'm still talking about food here. For example, a country like Qatar, or the UAE, but these countries have significantly less population, for example, than a country like Egypt, which has an excess of 100 million people that it needs to feed. So my question to you is, what can governments in population-dense countries then do to mitigate the stress of overpopulation?
So I think it's very important when we think about the population to frame it in some general terms first. But let me just start by saying thank you for having me here, and it's really a pleasure to be with all of you today. If we think about the global population trends, basically we've seen an explosion of the global population since the mid-1950s. Very, very strong population growth. And this has come about from several trends. There's, of course, a trend on fertility, but then also very importantly, there's a trend on increased life expectancy. And when you look at the higher income economies and the lower income economies, the gap in life expectancy has in fact been narrowing in recent years. So this is a first element to keep in mind. A second element to keep in mind when we think about the global population trends is that today more and more people live in lower income economies. And if you think about the challenges from population, there are challenges from having an aging and less fast-growing population. And that challenge, and we see that these days in France, we have a big discussion at the moment on pension reforms and how long we should work. But we see these challenges, which are a question of how governments can finance and deal with aging populations. And what we see in economies with quickly growing populations is also a challenge on how we can finance the various measures that are needed. We heard about this in the previous panels. Making sure for a quickly growing population with young cohorts that there are good quality jobs that offer opportunity to everyone. And these things don't just come about automatically. It's really about having strong, good policies. And we often talk in economics about a demographic dividend. And that demographic dividend typically comes about when you see declining dependency ratios, either declining dependency ratios with a lower fertility rate or declining old age dependency ratios as well. Usually it goes in the opposite order. We tend to get to higher old age dependency ratios, but ideally we would see these dependency ratios being lower. So I think when we look at the policy challenges that we have here, they are tremendous, but we should also look at population as being opportunity. And we also heard in the previous panel, there's a long shopping list of political measures to be taken. But I think the most important one, and I think this one is absolutely critical, whether we're talking about creating opportunities for populations, creating the green transitions, the digital transition, and all of them linked together, of course, is really this important role for public-private partnerships. It's really only the public sector that has sufficient financing capacity to take everything on board, but just having the public sector run it, we know historically this is typically quite suboptimal. So it's this public-private partnership, which I see as being one of the key features that we need to think about.
Yes, but let me just follow up on the private-public partnership. What happens in a situation where the private sector, and I'm here specifically talking about technology companies, they're all for automation, and they're all for self-driving cars, and they're all for artificial intelligence. We've heard this morning, and this is bad news for me as a journalist, that in a few years' time, actually by 2030, 90% of the content will be produced by artificial intelligence. So I might come looking for a job in Société Générale. But the point is I'm trying to make is they are at odds. Governments want to create more jobs for their people. The private sector, specifically technology companies, and even business owners, if I own a factory and I can automate a certain percentage of the jobs and pay less as a result, why wouldn't I do it? So the question is, do we have, and you hear two sides of the argument. You hear people telling you actually technology is going to create more jobs for you, and people are going to tell you actually, the truck drivers are going to lose their jobs, factory workers are going to lose their jobs, and it's going to essentially taking it back to what you just said about the protests in France. It's not going to be at the retirement age, it's about losing the job altogether. So from an economics perspective, where do you draw the line?
So basically, let's try and break it down into a few dimensions. First of all, I think that I belong to the group of people who see technology as being an opportunity. But there are two conditions for technology to be an opportunity. One is that we think about the distributional aspects of the gains from the technology, because technology, all else being equal, raises the overall income levels of a society. So we have a distributional aspect that we need to think about. And along with that, which ties in very closely, is thinking about creating enough educational opportunity so that people can go on and do other jobs, and that we can move around the resources. Now, this is very easy in an economic textbook. You know, on paper, it's very easy to write this down and say this is the optimal policy. Putting it into practice is incredibly difficult. And we see this in Europe today. We have a real challenge of social mobility. We've seen it in the US as well, a huge challenge of social mobility. And then you can end up in very, very difficult situations, because if you have fragmented societies with the haves and the haves not, we end up with social conflicts, tensions, and this can happen in any society. So it's very, very important that we think about those job opportunities and those distributional effects. Those are really critical. So let me just reassure you, though, I'm actually very optimistic about the future of good journalism, because, I hear a lot about these new technologies and everything like this, but I'm optimistic because I worry a lot about who's actually thinking in the world, okay? So everyone is tweeting, retweeting, repeating what other people tweeted, but who's thinking, right? So I'm optimistic that once the chat is doing all the nonsense, then we can actually start to really think hard. And I think that thinking is going to be good. So I see lots of room for good journalists.
Amen. I think I'm going to clap for you. Thank you so much for that comment. And certainly, yes, with all the chatter that's going on, the world does need, I believe, a moment to reflect and a moment to think and a moment to get the informed decision. And of course, one of the downsides of artificial intelligence is how quickly we can create deep fake videos and spread fake news. So it is a serious matter. Unfortunately, it's not the topic of our discussion today, but I would love to continue this discussion with you after the session. Allow me to go back to David, and I want to ask you, and I know it's not directly your field, but I would love to hear your thoughts about it. At least in this part of the world, there's enough resources to ensure, and then we've learned the lessons from the pandemic, there's enough resources to ensure food stability and security. The one problem that seems persistent, especially with a growing population, is water. Now, my question to you is, are we going to get to a point, can technology replicate what you're doing in the food industry in terms of making sure we have enough water for countries that are unfortunate enough? As you know, we're living in a mostly desert climate in this part of the world, not to worry about this issue in coming years.
Yeah. So, like Madeleine Albright, I'm an optimist that worries, but there's a lot of technology that's coming that is going to make us better water stewards. There needs to be public-private partnerships, and an important point is that often well-motivated people make very poor decisions that take the incentives from the entrepreneur, from the innovator, to solve problems. An example is we have this belief that water should be free. Maybe when it falls down to the ground, it's free, but once you have to move it, there's a real cost for it, and there's real limitations. We use more and more groundwater, stealing from future generations to meet our current needs. And if the government puts artificially low prices on water, then commerce isn't going to solve that problem. So well-intentioned people are saying, hey, people should have cheap water, but you're really taking away the tool for the innovator, the entrepreneur, to solve water. At AeroFarms, we'll use 5% of the needed water to grow a plant. So it's a closed-loop system. Think level upon level of growing. Whatever water does not absorb by the root structure, it goes through a series of filtration and goes right back. And then we put in nutrients and micronutrients, and then whatever the plants transpire, we dehumidify and put right back in the watering system. There's other technology that more effectively cleans water. Israel is a fantastic steward of water. I think they recycle 80% of their water usage. And there, it's not just about technology, but it's about behavior. People, and it needs to come. It's not just technology, but people need to have that mindset of how they use water. I mean, if you, like, when you turn on the tap, what water goes where, brown water and so forth. But there are technology solutions, there are behavioral solutions, the government, and it needs to be a multifaceted way that comes together and incentivizes the right behavior through the supply chain.
Understood. And you mentioned earlier in your earlier remarks some of the work that you are doing in the United Arab Emirates and with the PIF in Saudi Arabia. From a local perspective, we are very interested in knowing what's coming in the future, because, as I said, this is a desert climate. We know how good we are in certain things, but we also know our limitations. So, what does the future look like, or what are the projects that you're working on to ensure sustainability in terms of food in this part of the world?
So we've grown about 550 different types of plants, and we're always looking to reduce capital cost, reduce operating cost, grow new crops, grow them better. So today we make money off leafy greens, like kale, arugula, watercress. Tomorrow it's berries, strawberries, blueberries. The next day, like, we have partnerships with Cargill on growing cocoa that get transplanted out to the field to help cocoa farmers. Same thing with AB InBev with hops. So there's a B2C model, there's a B2B model. So we not only have in B2C, we sell products, but use our platform from a B2B standpoint, working with farmers, field farmers, in the case of Cargill and Anheuser-Busch, AB InBev, to more effectively grow to the field. But here, again, technology is finding ways where there are partnerships across platforms, whether it's field farming, indoor farming, and the partnerships that are coming together, like machine vision, we have a partnership with Nokia Bell Labs, we partner with Google, we partner with Microsoft. There's not intuitive technology coming into agriculture, and these platforms are getting exciting from ways to bring innovation in other industries together to solve problems that we live with every day.
Understood. Michala, I want to ask you, again, comparing this region to Europe, it's almost completely, the situation is completely at odds or completely in reverse. So over here, we have a significantly younger generation. I mean, I talk about my country, Saudi Arabia, we have 70% of the population that are less of the age of 30. It seems to be the opposite in places, many places in Europe. And in a way, this means, of course, the problems of the world are much a bigger concern for the younger generation growing up here. But when you look at this part of the world, do you feel? And I'm going to get to Europe in a second, but I want to also get a comment from you about your prospect of this part of the world, particularly regarding the growing population in this part of the world. Are you, like Madeleine Albright, an optimist with caution? Are you an optimist, period, or are you a pessimist?
I think all economists are optimists that worry a lot. And then there's a few pessimists in between. But I very, very rarely met an economist that was just an optimist, full stop. I'm not sure that really exists. But I think when I think about this part of the world, what we talked about earlier on the importance, especially for countries with large cohorts of young people, in being able to create value-added jobs, education. These things are absolutely critical. I think the point you're making about behaviors is really, really important. It's not just about getting new technologies, it's also about getting the right behaviors from people. And I think it's clear that when you have a large young population, it can be an opportunity for a demographic dividend. But just having a large population is not a lot of young people is not a sufficient condition. So you really need to have the right incentives in the policy, create the right structures around education, build out the infrastructure, make sure you can feed everyone. So it's really this long list, this long shopping list of issues that we've discussed. Because if those issues are not addressed, then you can very quickly shift into a society that becomes much more prone to tensions and risks, and this is precisely what we want to avoid happening. Now, I do think that in this situation, we heard about it earlier, we're talking a lot about this region, this region, this region, but one thing that really strikes me is globally, our ability to work together across geographical borders has been going down in recent years. And I think this is really a concern to me, because I think, as we heard from the previous panels, when we all do well together, this is really the best situation, when we can share technologies across borders, when companies can come from outside, come in and operate, feel that they have the right type of environment to do so. I think these are critical factors, but they're a long list, they're well known, they're very hard to put in place. And I think, to your point on incentives and behaviors, what we see, and we see it from Europe, the European energy situation, but we see it with water here, you need to create incentives. But just putting on higher prices is not enough, because then you also create social inequalities. So you need to create incentives while still making sure that you have those good distributional policies so that some people are not too hard hit on these structures. And I think, the policy on paper is very easy to write down. Putting it into practice is often very, very difficult.
100%, and I'm fully with you. And I think if there was a lesson learned from the pandemic and the recent mobilization of aid to Syria and Turkey, it shows that what we can achieve together is far greater than, or what brings us together is far greater than what divides us. I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today. I want to thank you again for a fascinating panel. My only regret is we didn't have more time, but thank you to the audience again. I hope this was worth skipping your lunch break. So thank you. Join me please in thanking our panelists for today, and that will be it from me. Thank you so much.